You're listening to RevOps FM with Justin Norris. Welcome to RevOps FM. For at least 20 years since HubSpot pioneered this concept of inbound marketing, content has been the lifeblood of how B2B companies go to market. We make it, we drip it out, we nurture people with it, we align it with our funnels, and we have a sort of general conviction that it makes people buy things, although that's also difficult to prove. And the content game is not going anywhere, I think, but it is changing. The landscape gets saturated, old playbooks stop working well, and it's also easier now than ever before for anyone to be a content creator with the rise of AI and the availability of new tools. So today I really want to look at where we've been and where we're going with B2B content, and to help guide us through that, we have Ashley Faus. She's a top expert and thought leader on content marketing. And for nearly 7 years, she's been at Atlassian, where she's currently the head of Lifecycle Marketing. Ashley, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This is going to be a fun one.
So maybe let's start with that kind of big picture landscape question. And maybe if you want to just zoom out, give us this macro view of like how you view the evolution of content marketing over the past 15 or 20 years.
Sure. So I was coming up as kind of a newbie marketer. I have a generalist background. And so I was just coming up when Marketo was starting to get big, when HubSpot had put out the inbound manifesto and content marketing kind of became a thing. And this concept that you could actually collect people's email addresses and then email them regularly and then see the journey of all the content that they consumed, the places they went on your website, connecting all of that with email. I just remember my first time opening up the Marketo dashboard and being like, is it weird that I want to just like nerd out and look at what all these people are doing? So now fast forward a decade and I'm like, why are we still collecting people's email addresses? This is stupid. Why are we gating content at all? I frequently rant about behavioral MQL in large part because people are still using that playbook from 10 years ago where they're like, oh, they downloaded 5 ebooks. We progressively profiled them and they're spending more and more time on the website, so they must be ready to buy. And I'm just like, have they told you they're ready to buy? No. The reason they're not buying is because they don't want to buy. I understand that there are a lot of teams and several of my colleagues who have actually had great success with both behavioral MQLs and what we would call hand raisers, right? I ran that playbook years ago in my career. But I think that as we've evolved and the barriers to creating, sharing content, to building an audience, as those barriers have gotten lower, that means that the noise has gotten a lot higher and the expectations have gotten a lot higher. And so I think that we are going to continue to see this decrease in kind of that traditional, put an asset behind a form, progressively profile people, email them a generic automated sequence, and really starting to see that shift into a lot more personalization, being much more focused on people who are raising their hands and making that educational content more available to them without assuming that someone looking for education means that they are also ready and able.
I came up through the B2B marketing world at around the same time as that era that you describe. And I remember it as almost like a golden age of marketing content. You had HubSpot doing really innovative things like a Guinness Records breaking webinar with like the most people, like there was thousands of people on it. I remember attending that webinar, or you mentioned Marketo, and John Miller wrote his definitive guides, which were really, meaty and valuable. And I almost wonder if those companies not became victims of their own success, but content marketing became victims of their success, and that everyone started to replicate it, but without the same thoughtfulness, where just anyone could spin up a whole bunch of SEO blog posts that became increasingly thin and lacking value. Do you see it happening that way as well? I want to give a shout out to the sponsor of today's episode, Knack. I love marketing automation software, but let's be honest, the email and landing page builders are usually terrible. You can't make it nice without a developer, and marketers are going to find a way to break things or go off brand. You do not have time for that. So Knack is totally different. You set the guidelines and then give your users a building experience that's slick, modern, and beautiful. When they're done, everything goes to your map at the push of a button. And don't worry, it supports global teams, approval workflows. It's got your integrations. So head on over to revops.fm/knack. That's KNAK, and get a special offer just for my listeners.
Yes. And I think the other big driver is that the feeling that you could now measure and attribute every single thing meant that every single thing should be measured and attributed. And that swing, I think it was the famous quote that's like, I waste 50% of my advertising budget. I just don't know which 50%. We almost swung the opposite way, where it was like, we can and should measure every single thing, and every single thing should be exactly attributed to pipeline. And so it swung this way. And I actually think it's coming back now with, multi-touch attribution and a bigger conversation about the attribution, where it's not how much pipeline did this specific asset contribute, and more of, in the deals that are closed won, what content was consumed on that journey? Those are two different questions. And if you look at the capabilities of that software when they were coming up, it really was more focused on how much did this asset drive, and you could measure it at the asset level, but only on your owned properties. And so we just swung into this idea that, okay, I'm going to put all the content on my site. I'm going to put it all behind a form. All of my social media posts are going to drive to a landing page to force people to fill out this form so that I can measure it. And now we're only going to measure social media by referral traffic and click-throughs to the website. We're only going to measure website success by form fills, content downloads, or in the case of SaaS and product-led growth, free signups, how many people signed up from that page. And I think that mindset is actually the victim of success. Is almost, if we can measure all of these things, we can only do this type of marketing so that we can measure it. And so it's still really hard to measure brand perception, sentiment, influence on revenue, even though we know instinctively that brand matters. And so there's some really interesting things. I think it's also the current discussion around demand generation versus demand capture, right? That semantics discussion is trying to get at the mindset of, are you talking to people who are in market and are willing and able to buy within the next quarter? Or are you trying to build that affinity so that when somebody does come into the market and they are willing and able to buy, they come to you first? And then people are like, true demand generation, isn't that just brand? And demand capture, that's what we really mean by demand gen. And then people also come back with like, well, technically lead gen, that's what content marketing should be doing, because, once you hit that MQL, that's a lead. So we actually need to be talking about demand gen, demand capture, and lead gen. And I'm like, guys, the same conversation we were having a decade ago about lead scoring, what counts as an MQL, what touch points matter most. Well, only the touch points we can easily measure, right? So it's kind of funny because I feel like the conversation takes on a slightly different angle, but each generation of marketer ends up, it's like you become your parents, you become the marketing leader that you were like ranting against when you were a newbie marketer, and now you are that marketer because you're talking to higher levels of leadership. So it's kind of a funny full circle moment.
It's these glorious semantics debates that we love to have for some reason, but you touched on so many important things there. So maybe just the thread I'll choose first to pull on is the one around measurability and what it says about, I guess, what content is for. Because if we expect that we're going to measure everything and then be able to attribute content directly to pipeline, that says something that it's almost, we're treating content almost as like a direct response channel. We're expecting it to perform in this way. How do you think of it? Like if someone said to you, what is content even for in marketing? Why do we produce it? What would your answer to that question be?
I would say that there are actually different intents, and this is around the audience intent and the next action they'll take. So to your point about using content as a direct response channel, that content is by intent content. This is someone who is looking to solve a problem by purchasing a product or a solution. That is by intent content. In that case, the next action we want that person to take after consuming the content is to contact sale, to book a demo, to sign up for a free account, to sign up for a free trial. Like, it's a buy intent asset. That's only one of the intent. There's also trust intent or affinity intent. And so this is what frequently people talk about when they talk about thought leadership content or they talk about brand content. Frequently what they're talking about is trust or affinity. And the next action is for the person to feel good about the brand, to change their perception about the brand. There's not actually a direct next action that we can measure. It really is more about sentiment, perception, feelings. Potentially they share the article on social media or they send it to their peers and say, hey, this was a super thought-provoking article. Or like, man, this company is smart. Like they know things. They know me or they know the industry. That's that. There's also what I call use intent content. So this is the next action is go into the product, or if you're using a service, contact your account manager or contact the person you're working with to actually use the thing. So if the next action is log into the product, so use case content, templates, jobs to be done, that is a different type of content, and particularly for product-led growth companies. That use intent content is really important, particularly during the onboarding and activation phases. It's also really important from a retention and expansion set of kind of phases of the life cycle, because if someone's not getting value from the product, they're not going to invite their colleagues into the product and they're not going to renew. So we've talked about buy intent, use intent, trust intent. There's also help intent or remediation intent content. So somebody has a problem, I can't log in, I'm trying to reach someone, I don't understand how this works, can you help me? Usually that person is going to be a customer already, but again, particularly when you see so many companies are putting their documentation online, it gets really fuzzy, right? Because you want to see how hard is it to troubleshoot this, particularly if you're an engineer, for example, and you're doing API integrations or you're building on top of another company's API. That help content of like, how do I actually fix this and troubleshoot this, or what are common issues, can be something that influences whether or not you buy that product. It's not intended to be for purchasing, but it might actually influence the purchase. And then the final content, which I think is quite the most misunderstood, is this idea of learn intent content. Everybody thinks that educational content is the best content. We're going to teach you something. And it's like, okay, what are you teaching them? We're going to teach them why our product is the best. Okay, so that's buy intent content. No, we're teaching. I'm like, you're teaching them why they should buy the product. That's buy intent content, right? Or like, oh, we're going to educate them about how to use the product. And I'm like, you literally just said it. It's use intent content. So true learn intent content, again, it could be practices. The next action might just be to think about it. It might be to incorporate something into your own workflows. It might be to share the article with peers or social media, but it's not taking a direct action that benefits the company. So when you ask me what is content for, my answer is, well, what is the next action that the audience is going to take? And that's how we think about matching the intent of a piece of content with the action and the usefulness of that content to the audience. It's not just asymmetrically, well, all content should generate revenue. Okay, well, there's actually a lot of different ways to exchange value with our audience through content.
And do you see those different categories and dynamics as sort of evergreen over the past, 20 years? And the external forms and the mediums and the distribution channels, those may evolve, but really these things are evergreen? Or do you feel that the content game itself is changing in some fundamental ways where there's like a rupture with how content has been used in the past?
I think that the trust intent or affinity intent content, I do think that has changed significantly over the last decade, particularly because the barriers to create and distribute content are so low. There is a flood of content. And so the ability to trust that the content is correct, that it's factual, that it's accurate, that it's up to date, that sense that you trust the person or brand that it's coming from, not just factually does it make sense, but like just on a gut level, if I see your name pop up in my feed or in my inbox, or I land on a website Do I feel like I can trust that information? So I'm not even going to consume the information. If I land on a site that's got like pop-ups everywhere and it looks like it was from 1996, like I don't actually care if you had the most rigorous and proper methodology to conduct your original research. I'm a little concerned that it's not that trustworthy, right? So I actually think that trust piece has fundamentally changed. And then I also think that the like help or remediation intent, I think that's fundamentally changed. Again, there's so many low code or no code solutions. There's so many, what you see is what you get. And there's so many automations. There's so many integrations that the assumption that someone should be able to figure this out themselves, like, I don't want to pay for an implementation consultant. I don't want to have to bring on advisory services for a year-long contract. I don't want to have a weekly call just to get this stupid product to work. So I do think that help or remediation intent content is a fundamental shift. Those are the two. I think that buy intent, use intent, and learn intent are pretty steady throughout. Again, to your point, the formats and the channels have changed, but I do think trust intent and help intent have significantly shifted over the last decade.
It's really interesting what you said about trust, because it made me reflect just as you were speaking. Like we said back in the day, a guide from Hubspot or a guide from Marketo on this is how you do this thing was very authoritative. And I looked to vendors to educate me on those subjects. And now I have almost an opposite reaction where it's like, if a vendor is saying something, it's almost guaranteed to be biased towards their own product in some way. I trust it much, much less. And I trust individuals at those companies much, much more. Do you see like a shift in the dynamics between the individual versus the brand in delivering the content?
For sure. And I think a big part of this is that because we have swung so far onto the every single asset must drive revenue, it all ends up being quite salesy. And so we've conditioned the audience to believe that anything coming from a brand is going to sell. Even if that asset actually doesn't sell, the assumption is if it's coming from a brand, it's gonna sell. And in contrast, individuals don't have to sell. So I'm actually a perfect example of this, right? Like I work for Atlassian. Everyone knows I work for Atlassian. I frequently talk about my work. I'll sometimes jump in on a LinkedIn thread and be like, hey, I'm biased, but like just gonna throw in a plug for Jira and Confluence for this use case, right? But if you look at the bulk of my content, I'm not selling anything. I'm sharing ideas. The thing I'm selling is the ideas that I want to spread. I want to work with smart marketers. And the benefit I get from sharing is if people adopt my ideas, I get to work with people who think like me and build on the way that I think marketing should be done. So when I do talk about Atlassian, it actually has credibility precisely because I don't always talk about Atlassian. You don't get this sense that I'm just out there being a shill and that somebody behind the screen is forcing me to say certain things. It's this weird dichotomy where it's almost more beneficial to have your employees not always talking about the brand so that when they do talk about the brand, it stands out as authentic and unbiased. And I do think having individuals say, full disclosure, I work for this brand, or hey, I know I'm biased because I'm a marketer for this product, but here's the pitch, as it were. So I do think there's still a place where the brand can lend a halo to an individual, but I think it is much more common for individuals to also lend a halo to the brand than it was when it was just a lot harder to create content.
And if I think of the trust dynamics of that situation, it's really all the years that you have put into your career, sharing thought leadership, speaking at conferences, going on podcasts, like you have built up credits in the bank that create that trust that when this person speaks, they have something genuine to contribute to the conversation. They're not just being a shill for a brand. So when you do say like, actually, I really endorse this particular product for this particular use case, whether you're biased or not by where you work, there's like I take that seriously, versus you can easily pay, or now with AI, churn out hundreds of blog posts, saturate search engines. There's nothing behind it. It just kind of shows up. It's very ephemeral. It really strikes me like that the people are being foregrounded in a new way. And it brings us then to this notion of like B2B creators, which we're sort of importing from the YouTube world and the TikTok world and all those things that the kids in Gen Z are doing. I've been calling it like the TikTokification of B2B, where we see like funny videos, like video games. They're not like polished and corporate. They're sort of rough, but they very entertaining. They're very interesting. And then another part of my brain goes like, is this actually selling anything? Like, is it entertaining the people that watch it, but is it helping? So maybe I'm just curious for you to unpack your perspective on this whole trend and where it's going.
Yeah, it's super interesting because I actually think this is an evolution of the previous trend, which was around why marketers need to think more like movie makers, why Netflix is the best marketer in the whole world. And creating a feature-length film that is an hour and a half to 2 hours long with some of the best actors in the industry, the best CGI, multi-million-dollar budgets for both the production and the distribution of that. Sure, if you have that, yeah, you can definitely create a Netflix level or a blockbuster level film. I attended South by Southwest. I mean, this was probably in 2014. And I went to a panel, basically, or presentation talking about how to create these awesome brand experiences. And it was the agency who worked on HBO's Westworld, which is this like alternate, reality where people are robots, and it was a whole thing. And literally the experience that they were talking about was that they had rented out an entire Southwest Airlines jet and were flying full jet loads of celebrities and influencers and people out to this desert full-on town. They had hundreds of actors, and they were like, so really when you think about this, how can you create this experience? And I'm like, yeah, if I can book out a full jet and fly people to a 3-day experience that is like this immersive full ghost town with hundreds of actors, yeah, I can generate millions of social media impressions and press coverage too. So particularly on the post with Kieran, the creator that he linked, I watched an interview with her where she breaks down her process. She's legit, she's studying videos. She has mastered YouTube Shorts. She's got spreadsheets. She's looking at every single one of her videos down to the second. She can tell you that every video needs to be exactly 34 seconds because that's at the 35th second, that's where she sees the drop off. And she knows that because her last 3 videos that were 37 seconds, 36 seconds, and 35 seconds underperform, right? Dude, I agree with you. If I had time to go down that rabbit hole, and I would say I'm pretty nerdy about the LinkedIn algorithm, I nerd out on that, not to that level. I don't have time to go all the way down that full rabbit hole. But I agree with you that if you give every single B2B marketer the opportunity to go down the rabbit hole on a single audience, on a single channel, on a single asset type, and you let them choose what they want to work on and what they want to create, 100% you can make things go viral. That's not a very fair comparison, right? So I think that's the first thing is the constraints are different, both in terms of time, money, then obviously from a metric standpoint, your point about is it selling anything? I would assume this gal is making lots of money, actually. Her videos, she gets 1 million views per video on YouTube. It would not surprise me if she is making a lot of money. Where that money is coming from isn't going to work from a B2B perspective. So I actually posted this in a follow-up. We had a video that we're actually working on because it doesn't have a lot of views. And so a couple of people are kind of poking at it being like, hey, why doesn't this video have very many views? Why did we create this if it doesn't have very many views? And the marketer who created it said, well, every single conference where we have a booth, people come up and ask us this question. And our salespeople are telling us that they get this question all the time when they get on calls. So we made this video to answer it. And then the next question was, well, has it actually influenced any deals? Can we actually point to some other metrics? And the marketer replied, well, actually, it was just shown in this several $100,000 deal that we're close to closing with this customer. And so in contrast to the traditional creator, B2B marketers don't actually need the biggest audience. We need the right audience with deep pockets. I don't actually need to get 1 million views a year. If I get the right 10 views and I get in the right rooms, Mr. Beast is the perfect example of a creator where everyone's like, he's making, tens or hundreds of millions of dollars a year. The flip side of that is if you look at his progression, his first year he made $3,000, his next year he made $20,000, whatever, right? If I'm a business and I make $3,000 for the business in a year, like, I don't have a job anymore. The business doesn't exist anymore. Even if I'm a solopreneur for myself, if I quit my job at Atlassian and I go all in on Instagram or LinkedIn and I make $3,000, like, that's going to be a problem for my household. There's some of it where, in contrast, I can stay in my job at Atlassian and close 10 deals, and they might each be worth 2 or 3 million. Cool. So you're telling me with the right 10 deals, you can make as much money as a YouTuber that gets 1 million views on their videos? Like, it's just not the same comparison. I think the mindset of experimentation, the mindset of optimization, the mindset of truly studying the audience, the narratives, the assets, and the channels, all of that we should adapt. There is a human behind the screen. So the storytelling, that sense of human connection, but the idea that virality alone is the thing we should chase, and that as B2B marketers, we're failing because we don't get 1 million views on our YouTube videos, that's where I start to get real twitchy about the metric.
Yeah, I think you put it really well. And the other difference that I think was implicit in your response is that, like, for a Mr. Beast or the YouTuber that you were describing, they are selling entertainment in exchange for your attention, which then, gives them ad revenue in YouTube. And in B2B, it's totally different. The video has to serve a completely different purpose, and the entertainment value may be like the spoonful of sugar that helps the medicine go down, so to speak, but then there has to be some other, now I feel a greater affinity with this brand, or I feel greater trust, or I'm more interested in what they do. And a lot of the stuff that I see, and this is what had me scratching my head, like, okay, yeah, it's good for a laugh, but it's also kind of silly sometimes. And I remember the creator, but I may not even remember the brand that they're doing it for. I just remember the skit and it was funny. And so I just wonder if it's actually achieving its goals. It may truly be achieving engagement, but not actually any marketing goal for the brand.
Yeah, it's interesting too, right? Because, so for example, my bio says marketer, writer, speaker by day, singer, actor, fitness fiend by night. Because I frequently incorporate acting content or fitness content into my LinkedIn posts, twice now it's happened where we've talked about doing something around like muscles and marketing. And it's like, yeah, we're just going to do bicep curls for a 30-minute live stream about marketing. I'm like, hey, I'm down. Another one was wanting to talk about running on a treadmill and talking about it. And I'm like, running is not my favorite, but if that's what we need to do, if that's your favorite, I'm down, right? So people do associate me with fitness, singing, acting, and performing. And I do think that that helps differentiate me and my content from a lot of the other creators on LinkedIn. But if you ask them what I'm an expert in, and when you invite me onto a podcast, you don't ask me for tips to build bigger biceps. You don't ask me for tips about how to audition for a show. That's not what I'm here for. And while you like me more because I give you those examples, or while you may think of me and be able to identify with me more because of those things, at the core, the reason you want to talk to me is to solve a marketing problem, right? So it's this interesting thing where I think that entertainment value is that icing on the cake, or to your point, it's the sugar that helps the medicine go down. It's not the point. I actually have other spaces where personal writing or pictures of cakes, that is the point. They achieve a very different thing. The reality is they don't achieve anything because I don't focus on those spaces, right? But if I want to achieve LinkedIn goals of being seen as an expert in marketing, I have to talk about marketing, and I have to talk about it at depth. There's plenty of people who can say my quippy phrasing is the funnel is dead, use a playground instead. I can just post that as a meme all day long. But at some point, somebody's going to be like, what do you mean by that? Can you actually do it? Have you actually done it? How can I do it? Like, you can't just run around declaring things dead as a meme and achieve your goal of being seen as an expert, right? So I think there is a balance of that more personal or relatable or funny, whatever it is, hook to keep people interested, but it does not achieve the same goals around expertise or revenue if you're a B2B company as that meaty content.
Maybe that's a good point to transition to talking about that concept of the playground. That's actually how I think I discovered your content, your LinkedIn, because I had made some off-the-cuff post about like, I just don't think it makes sense to map content to funnel stages anymore. And someone's like, oh, you check out Ashley's article here about the content playground. I was like, oh yeah, totally. That makes sense to me. People still, to this day, investors, other experts I talk to, they want you to go through that exercise of like, take your content, map it to the funnel, blah, blah, blah. So maybe just walk us through your point of view there and why that idea doesn't make sense. What do you recommend instead?
My mindset around the funnel is that it's a retrospective measurement tool, not a forward-looking strategy tool. So yes, if you look at deals closed won, deals closed lost, a certain amount of people are going to become aware of the product or service. A certain number of them are going to evaluate and figure out, hey, is this set of tools or this service going to solve my problem? A certain number of them will eventually buy. Obviously, if you are in some sort of subscription business, there's that additional fourth phase around retention, upsell, cross-sell, advocacy, where they will keep buying and they will tell other people to buy, or they will expand within their company and invite more users onto the platform. Factually, that is a thing that happens. But to say that a piece of content is awareness, like if we go back to the intents that I described earlier, what do you mean by aware? Like if I see that your company is hiring a lot of different people, and so I'm constantly seeing you on LinkedIn because people are announcing that they just got a job at X, Y, or Z company. I mean, technically I'm aware of the company, but am I in any way trying to buy from it just because I saw a bunch of job posts? Like, no. And I think that the other issue with the funnel is that it basically starts when the company recognizes that someone is on a buying journey. It completely ignores all the other journeys that they could be on and everything that happened before the company is made aware that they're on a journey, right? That's the first thing, is that people don't buy that way. Nobody wakes up and is like, today I shall be in the consideration phase. Like, that's not how humans work, right? Sure. If we retrospectively look, at some point they had to consider the product, but like, nobody thinks that way. I think that's the first thing. I think the second thing is that it tries to force people into this journey that only goes one way. So I've had this example, right? Pricing is traditionally considered a bottom of funnel or purchase or decision level conversation. But if I'm trying to secure budget so that I can even kick off a buying process, I have to get a sense of what the pricing is. So I had this issue. I, was going to look at buying a tool. My boss asked me, we were in the planning process, and he was like, how much money do you need? And I'm like, I don't know. So I reached out to a bunch of reps. I'm like, hey, what's the general pricing for this number of licenses at this tier of product? And they kept coming back and being like, you need to read this white paper. You need to book a demo. I'm like, y'all, I am not BANT qualified. And I know BANT is not the most current thing. I'm not on the sales side, but I didn't have budget.
You're trying to get budget. You
I
need a
didn't have
number
the
so that
B
you can
and the
get
T,
it.
right? And I'm trying to get budget. So finally, one person gave me pricing. So I was actually able to go back and said, hey, I need this much money. I got the budget. So then I came back to all of those vendors and I said, hello, I have budget and I'm looking to spend it in the next 6 months. So I solved the B and the T. And I even said, like, I am the decision maker, so I've got authority and I have this need, like I'm bought in. Here's a criteria of what I'm looking for based on my understanding of the problem. So I get on the sales call and they're like, 96% of buyers, and they're like going on and on about why I should care about this problem. And I'm like, I'm gonna stop you right there. I'm bought in on the problem needing to be solved. I'm bought in that a tool like yours solves it. Why should I buy your tool? And the number of reps that could not be like, oh shoot, she's trying to make a decision. Like, she's ready to spend. They wanted to like send me 5 case studies. And I'm like, why are you trying to educate me about a problem that I already agree with you about? I don't care. I don't need to see any more research about this. Show me your product, right? So again, that funnel mindset, it's like, well, we built this pitch and you just now arrived to us. You filled out the form. So that means you're in the awareness phase and it's your first call with a sales rep. So clearly you're just barely in consideration. I'm like, no, I'm in decision and purchase. So am I going to purchase you or am I going to purchase your competitor? They just couldn't even do anything, right? Like they couldn't figure it out. But then once I actually got the tool, I had leadership buy-in, but I didn't actually have user buy-in. So then at that point, I was asking them, hey, can you actually send me all that research so that I can convince the users why they should care about using this tool, and I need to convince the users that this is a problem. And they're like, oh, well, we're going to run onboarding sessions for you. And I'm like, no. See, here's the problem. The users are actually not bought in on this problem, right? Like, they're actually not bought in on why we need to solve this problem. So me as an economic buyer, I'm bought in and I bought, but my users, they're not bought in. So I actually need to go awareness, I guess, my users. And again, it's just like, when I describe that, everybody shakes their head and they're like, yes, that's the problem. And I'm like, great. Which of that content maps nicely into the funnel stages? And they're just like, oh, it doesn't really map very well. And I'm like, we're back to that intent about how you think about it. The other framework that I use for this is content depths. So conceptual, strategic, and tactical. And again, those do not have an intent. You put an intent on those. But that's really a lot of that education phase, whether it's education about the problem space, education about the solution space, the what and the why of the idea versus tools, key knowledge components, et cetera, equipping the audience to do their own research. And then obviously at the tactical level, it is rarely just log into the tool every day. There's probably some other stuff that needs to happen. What is that stuff, right? And so being able to have that different depth of content mix, I think, is a better way to think about planning, to make sure that you have enough depth in your narratives beyond just buy this product today and log in every day, and then when it's time to renew, see, you logged in every day, so you should renew because clearly you're getting value.
I've lived that experience you described with the salespeople so often, especially because I'm a more technical buyer, so I've done my research, and usually I just want to see the problem. And then I have to sit through the half an hour of slides where it's like, yeah. I understand. So there's a whole other tangent around the sales process and how it gets broken that we could go on. But contrasting that with this metaphor of the playground, that a playground is free flowing. There's no start or stop. There's no fixed thing. There are different, I don't even know what they would be called, but different pieces of equipment on the playground that can be used for different things. And you can sort of pick and choose where you want to go based on your need. It's very elegant and it's a wonderful metaphor. I think it makes a lot of sense. Practically speaking, trying to implement that, whether at Atlassian or elsewhere, maybe with clients, I don't know, but what have you seen, putting that into practice? Does the funnel just keep sort of reasserting itself like this sort of bad dream that we can't forget, or does it actually work and work really well to change the dynamic?
Yeah. I do a lot of language translation in this vein of cool, you want to talk funnel? I can talk funnel. Let's have that conversation, right? I do find that the funnel language is still helpful for buy intent content and journeys. Because again, yes, it's a handy retrospective measurement tool, right? So I'll give an example. And again, this kind of brings in that fitness background. If you ask the question, what does it mean to be healthy and fit? Most people agree it's some combination of diet and exercise. But you're going to answer that question very differently if you're Runner's World versus Muscle and Fitness versus Yoga Journal, right? So I like bodybuilding style workouts. So let's pretend that we're going to answer this question as Muscle and Fitness magazine. So at the conceptual level, you would say you're healthy and fit if you have big, strong muscles and you eat a high protein diet. At the strategic depth, you would probably be talking about things like different sources of protein or fast digesting versus slow digesting protein, from a diet perspective. And then, how to have good form when you're lifting. And then at the tactical level, this is 10 tips to build bigger biceps or 5 chicken dinner recipes to try this week, right? So that's how you apply it from a depth perspective. Then when you think about it from the intent perspective, notice in all of those things, I didn't sell you anything. I taught you about protein and lifting. You can easily start inserting products like protein supplements in there, or booking a time with a trainer, or buying a gym membership, or booking a time with a nutrition consultant, buying a meal template, buying meal kits, right? I can insert a lot of different buy intent CTAs into each of those articles. I can also tweak it, right? So let's say we're having a strategic conversation, a strategic depth conversation about macros. So how much fat, carbs, and protein should you eat in order to build big, strong muscles, right? I can have that conversation at that strategic level, and I can put in a buy intent CTA that is, buy this meal delivery service, and they will deliver meals to you that are the correct macros. I can also do something that is a use intent CTA, which is download this free template that will give you some recipe ideas. Within that free template, I can include a buy intent CTA that has affiliate links for different ingredients. Buy these egg whites or buy this protein mix that works really well for protein pancakes, right? From a help intent perspective, I can then send you to a forum where it's like, here's my stats, here's what I've been doing. I'm not losing weight or I'm not getting stronger. Can you help me troubleshoot this? So again, using my own personal example, I was chasing the one plate bitch, the 45 pounds on each side for about a decade, off and on for a decade. And I felt like I was doing a good progression, but I was struggling. And so I asked several of my colleagues, I've got a powerlifting coach colleague, I've got a sensei colleague, and then my husband is also kind of a traditional bodybuilder. And so I was asking them like, hey, help me troubleshoot my bench press. I could have hired a lifting coach to do that for me, but instead I went, the kind of help intent route of asking these other experts. So if you're a forum, you could include a buy intent CTA to pay the monthly subscription fee to join the forum. And then you're actually getting help intent content from the forum by saying, I'm going to post a video of me doing bench press. Why can't I lift this weight? And then people can say, oh, your form is bad, or, oh, your speed, you're lifting it too slow, or whatever it is, right? So when you think about it that way, the playground that I basically just took you down, it's like that. Wow, you can add buy intent CTAs, you can flip this to be use intent, you can match the depths with the different intent CTAs. You can do that in multiple channels, whether it's an online forum, like maybe you're browsing recipes on Pinterest, right? And you land on a chicken dinner recipe and the opening line says, protein is the key to building, big muscles. And so that's why you need this chicken dinner recipe. You can link that. And if I'm not convinced, if I don't know why protein matters, I can click that link. And it could take me all the way back up to the conceptual level about maybe a research paper that talks about, why protein matters or whatever. So if I'm already convinced that protein is very important, I could just keep going down the row of chicken dinner recipes, right? So that's that. I give that example because a lot of people understand at least some portion of that concept. I get it that it's very complicated when you start doing this from a software or B2B SaaS. That's what I'm coming from perspective, but we have done this exercise where, you've got agile methodology at kind of a conceptual and strategic level. We then drop that all the way down into, how to run your stand-ups, how to groom your backlog. Oh, and it just so happens we can give you a tutorial of, building and grooming your backlog in Jira. If you log into the product and it asks you what template you want and it says, do you want Kanban or Scrum? And you're like, I don't actually know which template I should use. Cool. Pop all the way back up to that conceptual or strategic level about agile methodology and the differences between Scrum and Kanban, so you can decide how you want to run your team. Regardless of the tool you use, if you're implementing agile methodology, you can use sticky notes on a whiteboard. But obviously, we would prefer that you use, one of our tools to implement those practices, right? So that's a quick example of how we've done that, to where you could see how it's mapped to the different CTAs at the different content depths.
And then in terms of the ecosystem you create for people to consume that content, is it about, contrasting it with like a traditional resource center where people lay out their content, you can filter it by format or by topic? Like, how do you think about structuring the sort of virtual environment of your playground so that people can easily navigate between those different places?
The biggest thing is understanding where your audience is already spending time and how they like to consume information. So there's not one right answer to this. There's obviously certain places where you have more control, like a resource center. And in that case, making sure that your filters, your tags, and your kind of cross-linking or what to read next or your video embed are in the language of your audience. The other big thing there is having clear CTA. So I'm on a whole rant lately against the learn more CTA. Like, what am I going to learn? Maybe I just learned, like, right? So if you, let's say you've given me a demo of the product, right? And then you're like, learn more. And I'm like, right, but you taught me how to use this feature. Am I not going to use it? Right? So like, use template, book a demo, contact sales, read the next article, download the ebook, right? Like that tells me what's going to happen when I click that button. So using the language of your audience on owned properties with filters and tags and navigation, giving them clear CTAs so they know, am I going down a buying path or am I going down a not buying path? And then obviously you match the intents per CTA. If it's a use intent, then it's use the template, log into the product, try it now, that kind of thing. And it takes you directly into the product. So that's for owned properties. And then for non-owned properties, again, it really depends on where your audience is spending time. So LinkedIn has different rules than YouTube. Both of those spaces have different rules than Reddit or Discord, for example. So playing by the rules, not only of the platform, but also understanding where your audience is and the expectation that they have when they are consuming, sharing, or discussing content in those spaces.
And then what about email? Because, the traditional way of distributing that content in a linear funnel fashion, it was supposed to be like, we have our content top of funnel, we get people in, we get their email address. Now we nurture them and we like drip out our content in this magical sequence that is going to like pop out a purchase ready person at the other end. And of course that, for all the reasons that you mentioned, that doesn't really map to reality, but email is still a channel. People still like Substack is bigger than ever. That's the example I always keep thinking of. Like people want to read things by email. So how do you, without trying to like linearize, if that is a word, the process, how do you think about distributing that content via email?
So I think the biggest thing is that previously email was basically used as a way to get you over to the website, right? Like looking at things like open rates, looking at things like click-through rates. It was intended to get you somewhere else out of the inbox. Similar to what we're seeing on social media, I love how Amanda Natemidad puts it, where she calls it zero-click content. How do you deliver that value where the audience is already spending time? So if you look at a lot of the newsletters that are very popular now, or emails that actually get opened and read, the bulk of the value sits in the email. It's not trying to send you off to another platform. And so I think that's the biggest thing, is understanding if you're curating an audience that wants, 3 quick tips every Friday. Cool. Give them the quick tips. And then sure, maybe include, a link that's like, yeah, we actually talk about this in our upcoming webinar or the webinar that just passed, right? But don't measure the success of that email based on whether or not somebody clicked to watch the webinar, right? There's also, Substack is a perfect example, right? Like that is a lot of really long, dense content that gets sent, and it's basically a 1,000-word article in the inbox, right? So I think that's the other big piece of this is like, don't treat email as a distribution channel for another channel. It's its own channel, and people want to consume that content where they are. And so if you've basically built an audience that expects to get that value from the email, just give them the value from the email. Don't make them click somewhere else just so that you can be like, haha, they clicked the link, right? It's like, okay, well, if the only thing it's doing, similar to social media, if you just put a bunch of links on social media and only measure the value of that channel as how many people clicked through to the website, like that's a super old school mindset that just doesn't work. People are too busy to like get a little teaser and then click over somewhere else. You need to give them actual standalone value. And then if they do want to click over, that's awesome. Let them do that, but you have to give them enough value directly in the email for them to continue opening and staying subscribed to that email.
There's a common theme of buyer centricity in all of these points, whether in the sales process or in content distribution or anywhere. Like, stop trying to ram people into our thing that we think it should be.
Yeah.
Just give them what they want.
Yeah. Well, it's funny too, because I hear this a lot where people are like, they're very focused on a buyer or a user. And they forget that this person is a whole human, completely outside of whatever your company thinks they should or should not be doing, right? And I think that's the other piece with the funnel. It only recognizes people as a buyer or a user. And so when you only approach people through what you as a company can get out of them, that's the thing that breaks the trust. That's the thing that makes people unsubscribe or roll their eyes or not click through. So it's not just about what is this person as a buyer or a user, like where's the asymmetric upside for them as a whole human versus I as a company have decided that you are this person and therefore you must take these actions, right? Like it's just, it gets wonky, and I get it. You know, I'm not a Pollyanna. I have to make my numbers too, but the personalization and the journeys that have actually resulted in me buying something are when that whoever's on the other side of that screen recognizes me as a whole human and can figure out how to unite all of these other things that I'm doing besides just, I filled out your form to contact sales to buy this specific product, right? Like it's that transactional mindset is, I think, the other big shift. It's not about rushing people to a purchase in as few touch points as possible. It's really about seamless handoffs that create a delightful and helpful journey no matter which path someone takes. Again, that playground mindset. It's about those seamless handoffs, and it's about that help, that empowerment, and that delight. And if it turns out that those three things end up making the person realize that, like, actually, it would be super helpful to buy your tool. Cool. That's a great fit for us. But I think there's also a lot of ways to exchange value, job candidates, co-marketing partners, et cetera, strategic partners, referrals. There's a lot of ways to exchange value. And I think sometimes we get so focused on just this one very specific value exchange of, revenue in exchange for a product or service that we forget that there's actually a lot of other ways to exchange value.
And maybe the last question that we'll have time for, again, back in the day, we had like your blog posts and your infographics and your ebooks, and like there were these certain formats, and those are still around, but then a lot more video now. What's changed from your perspective, if anything, in terms of formats, and what are you thinking about? What should other B2B marketers be thinking about when it comes to formats?
I think the biggest thing that's changed, I actually talked about this when I was discussing bringing live streaming into the marketing mix. So obviously it's much more common now. People do LinkedIn Lives, they do, Instagram Reels, et cetera. But it used to be that the spectrum was very small and it was binary. It was basically, you can do cheap but terrible, or you can do good but expensive. And there was basically no in between. And obviously if you were a brand, you had to do good but expensive because you're a brand. You can't put out cheap but terrible, right? What a lot of these lower barriers to entry did, particularly, and I think this started with live streaming, it actually widened it into a proper spectrum, not just a binary set of choices. So it widened the spectrum and it gave you a lot more gradient points along that spectrum. So now you can almost have this middle ground of moderate cost, but authentic. And so that ability to test and the audience being much more tolerant of less polished content. It's not that they're more tolerant of terrible content, right? Like you still have to have a baseline, decent audio, baseline, not shaky camera. You have to be saying something interesting, but it no longer has to be that perfectly polished $50,000 customer video that takes 3 months to produce and is heavily edited, right? So that ability to experiment and that ability to produce content with many more gradient options along that spectrum, that is a huge shift. And I think that is part of going back to that B2B creator mindset. It's funny because people talk about, creators are so much more entertaining, or creators are so much more authentic. If you look at the best creators, that content is heavily edited. Those editing tools are more accessible now. They're cheaper, they're easier to use, and you can experiment a lot more. So this is where I'm saying, it's not just, oh, B2B is still in this highly produced mindset. No, the best YouTube creators, their stuff is highly polished and heavily edited, right? The thing about them that is more authentic is that it's a regular human who is showing maybe their everyday life or something like that, right? They're maybe doing a selfie or whatever it is. So I think that that is a huge shift, that lower barrier to entry that has widened that spectrum and given brands and individuals more ability to create and therefore iterate and optimize different points on that spectrum.
Totally. And actually, I lied. Do you have 2 more minutes? Can I still ask you one more question? Because I just thought of something I'd really like your take on. AI. I mean, the content space is perhaps one of the disciplines of marketing where AI could most, not legitimately, but most realistically come in and like replace a lot of what you're doing. Not that I necessarily endorse that or think it will produce the same quality or anything, but how are you thinking about AI? Is it a threat? Is it a help? Is it a, where's your mind go on this?
So it's funny because I am still a bit skeptical about how much AI actually can replace, right? And I think some of this is because for a lot of people who are more senior and more seasoned, the type of work that you would ask me to do, you wouldn't ask someone like me to do that work if a more junior person could do the work. And so I've heard the analogy that like, oh, AI is like an intern, right? And I'm like, okay, well, an intern wouldn't do my work. So it's interesting because it's like, Ashley, but what if you could give this task, and this task, to the intern? And I'm like, right, but that still requires me to have a strategy, know the audience, frame the problem correctly, frame the steps correctly. That work that I'm doing is still valuable. And yet, it can be really great to give something to a more junior worker, whether that worker is AI or whether that worker is a human. So I think that's the first thing, is that this sweeping statement that like, oh, it's going to take over 90% of the jobs. And I'm like, okay, but the 10% of jobs that it can't do are real important then. And how do we train up the next generation of marketers? Part of the reason that I'm good at what I do is because I learned all those lessons early in my career. So the newer marketers, if the next generation of marketers is no longer learning by doing, how do we effectively train them to have that critical thinking, to do the troubleshooting, to know where to start, if we're not giving them that junior level work that they can eventually work through? And I think that's actually my bigger concern. It's less, oh, we're going to put all the marketers out of a job. No, we're going to reskill, we're going to upskill, we're going to, cross-train. But I do think that the underlying principles that you often learn early in your career by doing a lot of that kind of tedious work or analyzation work or optimizing, blog posts or optimizing videos or reviewing dashboards, right? If AI takes all of that work, what are the inputs so that you can become that 10% marketer that's actually doing the thing that really only the humans can do? That work becomes very important. So of course, I'm incorporating AI into my workflows. I'm experimenting with a lot of tools. Like, I think there's a lot of potential, but I from like a philosophical standpoint, I'm like, you guys are missing the point. For senior level marketers, they are doing the 10% of the work that the humans are going to keep. And how do we make sure that the next generation is prepared and able to keep doing that 10%? That we're all, oh, it's going to be 90%, only 10% human. Okay. Well, then we need to have a very serious conversation about that 10% that we keep as humans. We can argue about whether it's 90% or 50% or whatever, but the percentage that the humans keep, I think that's the piece that we need to be more concerned about in terms of preparation, assessment, and frankly, compensation for that work. That doesn't mean that our compensation should decrease 90% because we're quote unquote only doing 10% of the work. It's like, well, if that's the 10% that the human can do, that might actually be adding 90% of the value. So I do think that's the other piece of this, which I know we're at time, so we can't get into that, but I think it's a huge call out as well.
Totally agree with you. And yeah, we'll continue to see where it goes. It's certainly a wild time in content. And I think what we can say is it's not going to become any less relevant. So that's the good news. But yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Hey everyone, I want to invite you over to the RevOps FM Substack community, where you can sign up to get rough transcripts, show notes, longer form articles, and other bonus content. Just head over to revops.fm/subscribe to get free access. I'd also love to know what you thought of the episode and to hear suggestions for topics you want to learn about. Feel free to leave a comment on Substack or send me an email at justin@revops.fm. Thanks for listening.